must say, I don't think I have moderated or presented an academic panel in quite a few years. So I wanted to thank Brian for tricking me into doing this. So, and I really have been delighted to kind of dig into my old stuff and to be able to spend a few minutes to set these two superstars up to have a discussion about Trump and intersectional identities. So I am not directly going to talk about intersectionality in my opening comments, which will take a few minutes. I mean, I'm going to talk for a little while. But what I'm going to do is talk about why we might care about intersectionality when we're talking about politics. What does it matter? Now, they're going to spend time describing what it is, giving you examples, and taking you to great depths. But what I want to do is just set the stage. Some of this will be simple things that you've heard before, but it's also, maybe you haven't. I'm going to give you a little taste of what my own research was when I used to spend more time on that, and it'll serve as something to, again, as I just said, set them up. I'm going to start with a slide, and again, we're looking at why intersectionality might be, why we might care. How many of you saw this? Yeah. Okay. So here is this is the Freedom Caucus, as you may know, discussing what to do about health care. And I read that they were actually, when this picture was taken, talking about what to do about women's health care. So, yeah. And so let's look at this picture. I thought this was better. Did you see this one on Facebook as well? This is a little discussion about feline health care. So that's just, I'm going to start. But the next slide is one where I want you to take a look at this. What we've got here, and this takes us up until the 114th Congress, so the data for the new Congress is not in here yet. It shows you the number of males and females in the House and in the Senate, and then you get to look at change over time and get a picture of where you start to see gender intersecting with our legislators. So that's like a point one of intersection. We start to realize that all males, all legislators don't have to be male. And then in the second slide, we start to look at what the intersection is with race in Congress. So this is, again, the 114th Congress, and you can look at the House. The number of underrepresented women and men are in the deep hues, and white men are in the white hues. So but it's also split by party. So it just gives you an idea of who we have making the decisions. So, great. It's wonderful to look at the numbers, but what I want us to start thinking about is, why do we care? And what is it that we care about? So we're going to go on to one more slide and just show a minute of a clip from C-SPAN.
Well, there is a lot that could be said about the way this harmful legislation is just one big broken promise to patients and families, but I want to focus specifically on what it would mean for women. As someone who has fought time and time again to make sure that women are able to make their own healthcare decisions, I've seen a lot of very harmful, backwards efforts. But this Trump Care bill couldn't be a more complete example of a wish list written for and by extreme politicians who want to attack women's health. To start, it would cut off access to health services that millions of women and men get from Planned Parenthood. Now, some Republicans may claim that other providers can just simply pick up the slack, but medical experts called that idea ludicrous. Taking away access to care at Planned Parenthood means millions fewer people get STD tests, cancer screenings, and other basic primary care each year. Those are the facts. Trump Care.
Okay, so here, I just want us to be thinking as they're talking, does gender matter when making decisions? Does race matter? Do gender and race matter when You look at the outcome of a law. Does it make a difference on legislative policy preferences? Those who believe in descriptive representation, I think some of you know what this is, maybe others don't, argue that the government is really not legitimate unless it is the representative body mirrors the population. The closest we can get to direct democracy is if we do have a descriptive representative body. But there are those who believe in substantive or instrumental representation, and they'll make the argument that sex, gender identity, color, they don't matter, as long as the representative body is committed and attends to the issues that are important to these groups, that social and biological characteristics don't matter, that if white males are committed to these issues, then it will be fine. But we tend not to make those assumptions. We tend to think almost automatically that biological and social characteristics do make a difference, and that we do need to have different people making those policy decisions, that women look at women's issues differently. Poor legislators look at poor poverty legislation differently, that poor women legislators look at women and poverty legislation differently. And in fact, the woman who was just up speaking on C-SPAN just now about the health bill was Patty Murray. Patty Murray is a senator from Washington, and she had been on welfare for a long period of time. So she has been committed for most of her legislative career to issues of women and poverty, and especially to welfare rights. So it seems pretty simple that descriptive representation leads to substantive representation. And I say that, really clearly at the same time that I say that Sarah Palin represents women much better than does Bernie Sanders, right? So this is part of the problem. So there has been a huge debate. It's still going on, but it's been going on, forever. But it was fairly intense in the 1990s and through the late 1990s through the 2000s. Where people had actually spent an early part of my academic career on these arguments. I want to note that I would take weeks talking about this in class. I'm going to talk about this for about less than 5 minutes here, so I'm trying to pack it all in. But this debate is about whether, again, a descriptive body can make a substantive change. And as we listen to this, as an example, I want to make sure that you're translating it to what they talk to you. Is intersectionality going to make a difference? Do we need to have representatives from all different walks of life in the room? And we can get into a long conversation about this, but how do we do that in single-member districts here in the United States? That's actually quite a serious problem. So the debate takes many permutations. One of the first issues is, what is a woman's issue? How do we know that if you get a woman in, she's going to attend to the issues that are the most important to women? How do we know if a woman, second debate is over, how do you know if you get a woman in to Congress in particular, that she's going to spend her time on those particular issues? Or how do you know if you bring her in that she's going to get herself on the committees that make a difference? One of the things that I studied, not that I'm talking about much today, is that on reproductive policy, over a period of 30 years, there were only 4 women who sat on the committees that made a difference on reproductive rights. That goes from family planning to abortion issues. All of those things only had these key 4 women, and they, by the way, were not women of color through much of this. The first person who introduced family planning legislation to Congress in 1969 was George H.W. Bush as a Congress member from Connecticut. So people want to know, what are these women's issues, and are women, if they do matter, are women in the place to make a difference? So this debate began, just to go briefly back into history, when women sought public voice, and before they could participate in, they didn't own property, and they weren't able to vote, they became active on the premise that they were going to be less corrupt, and that they were going to bring in, they were clean up government. They came in on social and moral crusades. These were women's issues. Get women into office, and they were going to again, clean up government. So prohibition became an issue, educational reform, and mental health reform were some of the examples of women's issues. By the 1980s, when the gender gap started to be evident and when there were more women voting than there were men in raw numbers, we started, and when women stopped running for office as wives of legislatures, daughters, or sisters. I mean, seriously, there's a day in the late 1960s where the first woman who ran on her own without any connection to a man was elected to office. So in the 80s, you start to look at, well, if you've got women coming in and they have their own issues, and they aren't, we don't have any evidence the government's less corrupt, what is it that they are paying attention to? So there's a lot of study and data that's being thrown out there saying that women care more about caregiving issues. So again, education, healthcare, welfare, war, nuclear freeze kinds of issues, unemployment rights, and reproductive rights. So then, but what's going on with legislative scholars at this time, and they're the ones who are dominating the world of American politics and actually making recommendations for how we structure government and what kinds of legislative rules and procedures Congress and legislative bodies need to have. They're out there arguing that descriptive representation does not matter at all, except that it provides legitimacy for government. I mean, that's a good thing. But it doesn't matter that all legislative voting is basically dependent upon ideology. So whether that means whether you're a Republican or a Democrat. So they argued by going through the voting records from 1796, congressional voting record 1789, all the way through till this is 1996, showing that there's a single left-right ideological dimension that accounts for all congressional voting. And that, I mean, if you're a black woman and a Republican, that their argument would be, you are going to vote Republican. There is only one dimension. And there's still people who are out there that say that is exactly the way it works. So some of my early work happened to be, one piece was, I argued that the voting tools that were being used by legislative scholars to say how voting preferences were measured or determined didn't include women's votes. It's like a healthcare study, studying the hearts, and you don't have women's hearts in the study. Well, there were none of these voting tools included gender issues. So I created a new tool that included, women's issues in the vote. So reconstructed the entire thing and ran some data. So there were a handful of scholars at the time who made an argument that slavery, between 1860 and 1875, any votes on slavery went beyond the ideological, the left-right dimension. And then again between 1941 and 1971, but with civil rights legislation, that there's more than one voting dimension, Republican or Democrat. So there's a teeny bit of evidence out there that there might be other voting dimensions. So, but again, well, I won't even say the again, I gotta turn the floor over to these two. I did a second article after that showed that there is more than one dimension that explains outcomes. And again, what this would say is that having a variety of people on your legislative body makes a difference. That it's not just party that determines votes. But what came out of this study is that it's not moral or social, going back to when the right to vote was given to women. It was not caregiving or education, but it was women's rights legislation. That lawmakers looked at women's issues differently than the Republican Democratic dimension when it dealt with issues of equity and issues of reproductive rights, issues of pay and employment rights. And so that kind of matches the civil rights legislation data that was out there as well. So having different people in the room and actually in the room where the decisions are made, which is a whole other discussion, are important. Why does this kind of work matter? First of all, many nations have what are called quota systems. I don't know where there have to be a certain number of women elected to the parliament, or the parties have to run a certain number of women, or a certain, actually it's women. I don't think intersectionality has become an issue. This is actually a nice transition. That we have been studying women and how they make a difference, but we're just moving into looking at the different layers and how those layers will make a difference upon policy outcomes. My most recent, like 1 minute away, my most recent work that I have not submitted yet looks at how Congress handles international women's rights and do they support it or not? Is there a gender difference or not in whether it's introduced or pushed through the legislative system? And what is coming out, what has come out with this data is that on international women's rights, the male legislators they're the ones who focus on caregiving and sex trafficking. And those are the only bills that they pay attention to, but the women legislators pay attention to gender violence and they pay attention to gender equity worldwide. So there's a distinction between more of a paternalistic approach versus an equity approach. And so uncovering this is important, and having people in the room that don't look like one person make a difference.
My remarks are just to situate us in a shared context of thinking about what intersectionality is. Most of you probably know, but in case anybody's like, hey, I'd like a definition, I'm going to offer you one. And then just to talk about some policies that are presently ongoing that raise issues about a failure to address intersectional identities. So our classic statements of what intersectionality is, and that is a mouthful, really come from Black feminist thinkers and writers or social activists. And everyone may know the famous speech by Sojourner Truth called Ain't I a Woman? If you've never read it in total, you should Google it and read it because it'll make you fired up and mad and ready to,
Make you cry.
burn something down. We have different emotional reactions. I'm ready to, throw gasoline on things. And basically the context of that speech is Sojourner Truth was a former slave. She had been freed. And she was at basically a town hall type meeting in which women's rights were being discussed. And there was an image of woman being portrayed as having petticoats and needing to be lifted into wagons and ushered over mud puddles. And effectively she stands up and says, hello, I have been tending the fields and working with my bare hands, and ain't I a woman? And I can carry, more weight than that guy over there, and ain't I a woman? And I don't adhere to any of your standards of femininity. And she just punctuates it every time with ain't I a woman? And so the basic idea is your concept of woman is based on a particular idea of white, middle-class, privileged woman. And if you rely on that concept of woman to organize around what women need, then you will leave out, further subordinate, create greater inequalities with women who don't match that definition. And moreover, you have a partial definition that you're universalizing, and that's harmful in all sorts of ways. So that's sort of the classic example statement of intersectionality. Now that is just, an example of the way that race and gender intersect, right, to create different cultural, social, political identity experiences for groups of people, right? And so this idea gets taken up, so that's sort of in the first wave of feminism, right? Which culminates with the right to vote in the 19th Amendment. And then you get kind of a lot of socialist feminism going on that no one really talks about. And then the second wave happens, right? I'll just flash over that socialist stuff that nobody talks about. Because we carve it up in waves, but it's like the first wave ends and then the second wave doesn't start for a while. But like birth control, unionization, all sorts of stuff was going on there. It just didn't get a wave. Sorry. So the second wave then starts with this very famous book by Betty Friedan. and it is called The Feminine Mystique. And in it, she's going to tell us the problem that has no name, these problems that women face. It's horrible. They're housewives, they're bored, their dishwashers wash their stuff, their laundry machines do that. They're sitting around the house all day waiting for the kids to come around, so all they can do is form wine clubs and play bridge with their other lady neighbor friends. Right? Sad lives these women are leaving. And so, once again, black women in particular said, what the fuck? That ain't my life, right? I'm not suffering from the pampering of my domestic life. I might be cleaning your floors. This isn't obviously true of all black women, but black women with working class or lower class circumstances led this kind of charge. And so, once again, we get an articulation of the way in which the idea of woman is exclusionary in certain feminist texts and in certain feminist practices, right? And so, second wave, I could say more about that. There are pockets of it that are not exclusionary in the way that some of it was. And then we get what's called the third wave of feminism, which is the sort of blossoming of intersectionality. I have a hard time saying that. I would put, and this is perhaps controversial, the beginning of the third wave with the publication of Bell Hooks' Feminist Theory, Margins to Center, which is a statement of intersectionality of African American women's social position relative to white women's social position, and creates a vision of solidarity that would create a true feminist movement. The argument being a feminist movement, right, that empowers white women to get jobs by having women of color take care of their children and clean their houses so that they can work these high-paying, high-demanding jobs. Ain't no feminism I want to be a part of. Right? If white women are excelling off the backs of women of color, that is not feminism, right? It's some kind of elitism. So Bell Hooks' book made a big impact. Though she didn't develop the word intersectionality, a brilliant scholar named Kimberly Crenshaw at the University of UCLA, I realized I did that wrong, at UCLA, developed the concept of intersectionality. Let me rephrase. She didn't develop the concept, she coined the phrase to describe this concept that goes back to Sojourner Truth. And basically the idea is people can belong to multiple social identity groups, and when those social identity groups intersect, they create new experiences, new social realities, new problems, new forms of inequality, new hierarchies that have to be addressed, or we will perpetuate inequality or injustice. So the classic example that Kimberly Crenshaw wanted to focus on was the way in which, or draw our attention to, was the way in which if you wanted to make an employment discrimination claim, you had to claim a ground, and you could claim race as the ground, or you could claim sex as the ground. So I was discriminated on the basis of my race, or I was discriminated on the basis of my sex, but you could not combine grounds. So you couldn't be simultaneously discriminated on the basis of your sex and race. That has since changed, in part due to the scholarship of Kimberly Crenshaw. But so the idea is this: African-American woman goes to apply for a job, she's not hired. She claims she was discriminated on the basis of her race and sex. So the court's going to look at it, and they're going to say, okay, were you discriminated on the basis of your race? What's the relative comparative group? Black men. So they look around the pool, they say, oh, they hired black men, so they don't have a race problem there. And then they say, okay, were you discriminated on the basis of your gender? They look around, oh, there's white women everywhere. You don't have a gender problem. You were twice not discriminated against, rather than twice discriminated against, right? So that was what Kimberly Crenshaw wanted to draw our attention to, that identities intersect so that new forms of discrimination against black women that aren't identical to the kinds of racism black men experience or the kinds of sexism white women experience. And obviously there are more groups than white and black. I'm just narrowing the focus for purposes of examples and brevity. Okay, so how does this bring us to where we are now and what I'm going to talk about? I'm going to talk about, you may have seen this. The title of this is I Wish I'd Never Called the Police. It's an article on Slate.com, and then there's another one in The Guardian, says fearing deportation, undocumented immigrants wary of reporting crimes. So, in the 90s, Congress wanted to address a problem they were convinced existed with respect to the marriage fraud provision of the Immigration and Nationality Act. And the problem was this. In order for immigrant women to apply for permanent resident status or a green card or ultimately citizenship, they had to show that they'd been married for 2 years, ongoing, continuously cohabitating with men. And as a result of that policy, immigrant women refused to report their abusers to police for fear of deportation. And the result of that policy was that there were a number of high-profile cases in which immigrant women were murdered by their husbands and failed to seek police protection because of fears about deportation. Okay? So Congress amended that act to allow that women who could provide evidence through some kind of official reporting procedure that they were subject to domestic violence could have the 2-year marriage thing waived. Okay? But even that didn't go far enough to protect women in abusive situations, because often they didn't have access to the resource because of intersection with class or poverty or education or language, right? So in some cases, the only English language access to information immigrant women have is their husbands, right, or fiancés who may have brought them over from their native country, and they will often give them false information, abusers will, and claim that if you call police at all, you will be deported, or the children will be deported, or you will be separated from the children, or any manner of thing. And so immigrant women who are multiply vulnerable along language or education or economics were not being reached by this exemption and were not being reached by services. Okay? Add to that domestic violence shelters then and sometimes now focus their mission on getting women away from abusers and narrowly conceive of their job as to stop abuse from happening or ongoing in that particular context. But women who are multiply vulnerable across different accesses, class, race, immigration status, need resources beyond. They're not going to be able to stop the violence until they have job skills, they have English language skills, they have other resources, and domestic violence shelters say, well, we can't do that, we can't do it all, our job is just to do this. So if you don't envision the mission in terms of the complicated identities of the populations you serve, you end up effectively serving, and this is going to sound like a weird sentence, the most privileged among the vulnerable populations that you're addressing. So how does this come to President Trump? Well, President Trump has announced a policy that police should inform ICE agents whenever they suspect aliens, and all aliens who can legally be removed are subject to deportation. So I have that in quotes. All removable aliens, which suggests to me that I copied that from somewhere, so I think that's probably the official line. All removable aliens are subject to deportation. So in response to that similar kind of problem with immigrant women that was addressed in the 90s, there was a similar exemption written for the Violence Against Women Act, in which immigrant women could apply for a U visa. And a U visa is a visa that you basically get relatively quickly if you're assisting police in solving a crime. Okay? And so the idea is women will report their batterers and their rapists because when they report, they can immediately apply for a U visa. That U visa will protect them from fear of deportation, so we don't have fear running rampant and failure to report cases of rape and battering. Well, this all removable aliens includes holders of U visas. Okay? And the result has been, with Trump's appeal to local law enforcement to hand over illegal immigrants to ICE, the result is massive fear within communities that have a lot of immigrants, or as the article says, Hispanics. And so I just wanted to read you this one little bit. No. Here we go. Many immigrants have fled. I've been talking all day. I just taught a class. I haven't had enough coffee, and intersectionality is a tongue twister, so I have used up my enunciation skills. Many immigrants have fled countries where the police are as dangerous as the gangs. In my country, the police don't exist, Maria, a 44-year-old from Mexico who lives in the Boston area, told me. In the U.S., when her husband brutally abused her, she kept silent because she didn't feel entitled to protection. When I had no papers, I felt like nothing. Her husband promised that if she reported him, he would call immigration and have her deported. Abusers use that as a threat. Or he said he would make her children disappear. She feared he would send her daughter and son to his extended family in Mexico and she would never see them again. It was only when he attacked her with a knife in front of the children she decided that nothing could be worse than staying in that house. She called 911. Her husband was eventually deported back to Mexico, where she has heard he is now in jail for killing his second wife. Maria is acutely aware that it could have been her. She applied for a U visa in 2010. She has said that being able to do so not only saved her life, it told her that no one had the right to take her life in America. She now has a green card. I feel like I'm a human being, she told me. I have a name in this country. Under the policies of basically deport first, ask questions never or later, women in particular, immigrant women, are going to be especially vulnerable. Reports of rape and domestic violence are down among these populations as documented in these articles. And so when we fail to attend to the multiple layers of identities and we fail to attend to multiple vulnerabilities, we end up making the least well off worse off.
Yeah, thank you for my colleagues setting the stage here, and for that history was really helpful. Just an idea, how many of you use intersectionality consciously as a part of your work? I'm just sort of seeing about 2/3 of the hands, so. Do any of you use it without realizing it?
Yeah, I used to. Couldn't use the other hand.
Yeah. Well, just to really lift up some of what my colleagues have framed, it's important to just take a moment to just acknowledge the importance of the contributions that have been made by African American women to our fundamental understanding of injustice, justice, and sort of what we want to do with our country. This is intersectionality, as my colleague Dr. Watson so eloquently traced the history of, has many levels of crucial contribution that it's made, but it really comes from this idea of a grounded or situated perspective, a grounded or situated political consciousness, and a grounded or situated political activity, right? Mm-hmm. And so to credit African American women with the many ways in which socially there have been a firestorm of ways in which they've been invalidated, misnamed, mistreated, that you would get such generous and loving theory coming from them is I think just needs to be just addressed directly. It's also very profound that there's a lot that you can do to take off from the concept. There's so many ways you can apply the concept to different cases that you're looking at, and we just saw that just in the representative political context. We saw that in terms of the grassroots experience of working class immigrants, and so I don't necessarily want to add a whole lot to just the general discussion, but I would want to just call out at this point sort of what intersectionality isn't necessarily like a lens or like a set of glasses that you just like put on or it applies in certain cases. Like intersectionality isn't when you're talking about, like feminism isn't when you're talking about just women, gender isn't just women, intersectionality isn't just when you decide to talk about race and gender. Intersectionality is a way of understanding how everything works. So I think it's important to call out what I would just say. I'll just come out in my view, the best that I can understand it. We're now entering an era of what I would call an incendiary white heteropatriarchal kleptocracy. Okay, so white heteropatriarchy is hopefully 10 times fast. Go. No, white heteropatriarchy, is that a somewhat familiar concept? So if you think about white heteropatriarchy, that's really the core of where intersectionality starts. It's reacting to the fact that norms are set and social norms and social power are set around race, which is white, hetero, which is a sexual orientation. And by the way, that's a performance, of course, because dudes be doing all kind of stuff, but as long as they appear to be happily married and acknowledging their wedding vows, then they can occupy this authoritative category of heterosexual. But we know the life of the mind and the life of what's hidden is, of course, sometimes scandalous and sort of loses that. Patriarchy, pater is the gender, the male, and archy is the class status. So when you take the core of the concept, it really forces you to get at all of these crucial axes on which our society is divided. And I think depending on how you're situated, some of those can be really difficult to talk about. I would say sometimes it can be a little relatively easier to talk about gender, relatively easier to talk about race. I think we have a lot of problems talking about class. Mm-hmm. And intersectionality doesn't it's not like you can just take one or two of those that you're comfortable with and just sort of dabble in them. I mean, it's like you really have to get to the roots and the core of where oppression and where inequality is actually, like how it's functioning, and then get a better perspective on how to address it in its multiple overlapping and fluid ways that it functions. But so white heteropatriarchy to me is very much back. Incendiary to me because there's this, I mean, I can't think of a better word for how gleefully in your face and brazen, unapologetic, arrogant, hateful some of the iterations are. Incendiary to me would be a good way of sort of identifying why you have this sort of real pass, almost invitation for these extremely fascist and reactionary, horrible ways of talking about racial authority. And I mean, and also the incendiariness of it, I believe, has also sort of helped us see why there's been such a broad reaction to it. Because basically anyone who has any aspect of your life where you can kind of be offended on, you're being offended, and that the moment sort of calls you now to activate, because whatever your issue is or your situation is, it's likely that you're getting some type of an attack. So, and the kleptocracy, I think, is it's a little more subtle of a point, but it's really acknowledging that the way the system is functioning is, if you look at the Department of Justice report on the city of Ferguson, for instance, which, funny enough, just didn't really carry much of the day in terms of the trial, right? The Darren Wilson trial and Mike Brown. But if you look at the study that comes out of the Baltimore Police Department, I mean, you're looking at what's being called revenue policing. I mean, you're looking at police departments that consciously create and set policy on going out and getting the numbers, right? This is based on stats policing. This is based on some of the broken windows, some of those theories and stuff. But it's really like, go get the numbers. And where are you going to get the numbers when you're shaking down people for fines, violations? So this is fairly scandalous. And you have this gross overrepresentation of essentially police officers of whatever race they are going after African Americans to nail them with parking tickets, nail them with jaywalking tickets, nail them with curfew violations, nail them with whatever they can. And that is actually a quantifiable revenue stream for some locales, like the Ferguson jurisdiction. And then it's an irony. I'm wearing a shirt about solidarity with Standing Rock because what you see, despite all the conversation around needing to minimize government, what you actually see is a shift from what we would call broadly a welfare state. So meaning, like, we care about how well people are educated, about the quality of their life, about their ability to eat, their ability to work. You care less about that, and you don't intervene the government, but you convert all of this money and resources into a militarized police state. And that police state plays the role of being a security force, being a thug, whatever. It protects interests, and it puts the private property interests of a small group of people and their ability to pull profit off of whatever deals they got going on, whatever free enterprise they're working with. In other words, our concepts of free enterprise require an enormous militarized state to protect the limited interests of a small group of people who call that freedom, freedom of expression, freedom of access, and freedom of all these things. Yet there isn't a conversation. I'll be referring at points throughout my brief comments here. I had a chance to see Angela Davis speaking down at Southwestern College just a couple of weeks ago, and she made a really poignant point on this, which was when corporations, so the idea of sort of neoliberal flows of capital is the free flow of movement, people's goods, ideas, right? And when corporations join that flow, they're not called illegal corporations, right? So they're able to outsource, they're able to resource, they're able to whatever they need to do in order to work their operations. But when people, however, join the flows, they're called illegal human beings, right? So people don't have the right to follow the opportunities, to follow the sources, to create better opportunities for themselves. They encounter closed borders and they encounter state violence. So it's a misnomer to talk about this as a smaller approach to government. It's just a shift to a very forceful and militaristic way of protecting a certain narrow version of exchange that's monopolized by a small number of people. So the kleptocracy piece is this idea that it's a system that's based upon thieving the literally the money, thieving the rights, thieving the opportunities in life of vast numbers of people in order to create the narrow base of power and privilege. So whenever we talk about intersectionality, it's really stemming from that. So it's those who are affected by that system in the different ways that they're affected, be they forced into migration and then experiencing additional gendered vulnerabilities along with their citizenship status vulnerabilities, along with their general working class impoverished vulnerabilities, along with their general racialized vulnerabilities, and then the people who they displace. When you think about like the Gulf Coast after Hurricane Katrina, you had this shift from poor and working class African American demographic to a largely immigrant labor demographic to change the social landscape, the political landscape, and as well as the cultural landscape to de-black the city. So I think there's an urgency of this political moment that it's hotter than it has been for a while. And for many of us, it's been hot this whole time, but it's even hotter now, and it's hotter more clearly for more people. And there's a tremendous inadequacy that we have in our frameworks of grasping what in the heck is going on and how we're going to address it. So some other comments that I'm just biting Angela Davis, but when you're talking about intersectionality, to quote and draw heavily from our foremothers and our sisters who are leading the theory, I think is hopefully an appropriate way of addressing that material. But she had a couple of really cool comments about diversity, right? So many of us are invested in diversity, or some of us are invested in diversity and whatnot. But she had these comments of like, it makes no sense. She was like, you got an institution that's trying to diversify. She said, it makes no sense to take people who are marginalized or oppressed by an institution, bring them into it, not change that institution and expect something else to happen, right? Another way she said it was diversity is difference that doesn't make a difference. And this, I think, is likely the dominant framework that we have going for us that we can sort of use or take action on when it comes to addressing intersectional disempowerment, intersectional issues. And that makes it really the time for us to be able to dig more deeply into intersectionality and recognize that it's, again, it's a theory, it's a situated theory based off of oppression. It's not just a sort of general, sort of like for intellectual kicks, thinking about, oh, you're different in this way, and oh, gender means that to you. It's really getting to the roots of how difference is produced as a way of literally staving off life opportunities, like turning people into exploitable resources or turning people into those who can take advantage of those resources. Just a brief comment about a couple of angles that I think, maybe I'll just make it specific to the Black Lives Matter movement, because that's something that many people are familiar with. Hopefully, have you heard of Black Lives Matter movement? Hopefully you have, okay. Obviously, it's a very hotly debated and contested movement that it's decentralized and has different versions of it that have sprouted in different places, but it really starts from the moment that you can have a system take the life of African Americans, leave them sitting and laying in the street dead for hours, just the absolute degradation of humans, literally taking their life and then having no respect for it. And then on top of that, you spin this narrative of like, well, they deserved it because they smoked pot, or they deserved it because they were big and scary, or they deserved it because they weren't following directions. It's a series of things that have happened in example after example of of law enforcement officers killing African Americans that really it flies in the face of American jurisprudence, right? It just flies in the face of anything that would resemble something like you have rights as a citizen, you have a constitution that protects you from discrimination under the color of law. In cases where you have revenue policing, you have the right to not be pettily discriminated against, and then when it reaches the extremity of you being mistreated and hurt, that you have a right for that not to happen. So it just basically goes the opposite direction of all that stuff. And the brief comments that I wanted to make is part of what's so important about the Black Lives Matter movement is it has kept intersectionality in the spotlight, in the conversation, more so than perhaps any other movement recently. So this is African American women, queer Black women, who start a movement of affirmation, of situated, self-grounded affirmation that really is a sort of passing of the torch from this legacy of African American women formulating what this situated oppression is like, how it's experienced and what it means. And so the Black Lives Matter movement, it's interesting because you get this discussion of gender norms, you get this discussion around homophobia, transphobia, identity expression, you get this discussion around class status and opportunity. You get these things internal to the discussion of what Black Lives Matter is, and at the end of the series of what's going on, you have this sense that, okay, all of these Black Lives Matter. And we're not just going to say Black Lives Matter, Mills gets a job at USD, so Black people are cool. Fantastic book along these lines, if you're interested, is Keeanga Yamada Taylor's From Black Lives Matter to Black Liberation. It's a fairly brief, very readable summary of this historical context and framing around the movement. And her essential issue that she's dealing with is how could you have this post-racial moment with Barack Obama as the president, which for many is, and I think rightly so, is a very important symbol of a true change. I mean, this is like something really different happened when you have an African American elected to the highest office. How at the very same time he's in office do you have these police murders and the arising of a Black Lives Matter movement? Now that, regardless of your viewpoint politically, like that's an interesting question, right? Because how, at the moment you're supposed to show, and it even goes farther, it's like how in the case of Freddie Gray in Baltimore, do you have, so this is, he's roughed up, rough ride, they drive him around and he comes out of the car dead, right? He broken neck and all that kind of stuff. So the question is, how do you have Black police officers with a Black police chief in a city with a Black mayor in a country with a Black president have these situations and a popular movement arise that's literally like riots in many cities, right? So And it's this changeover point between a sort of classical civil rights vision that if we can just have this representative democracy, if we can just get African Americans into those positions, if they can just have their hands on the tools of the system, to do an Audre Lorde piece, right? If they can just grab those tools, then we can turn this ship. We can actually make more justice for the average black folk on the street. And so it's that not happening really is what leads this generation of youth to just say, all right, we're done listening to these former strategies and we're done listening to pontified speeches and dignification. We're just going to sort of express ourselves and we're going to fight for the justice that we think is needed. And so it is decentralized in the sense that there isn't one ideology, one mindset, or one group doing it, but it is a productive space where people are keeping the questions of intersectionality, including class, including sexual orientation, gender, nationality, race, right in the heart and the center of the questions around what justice do we have and what justice do we want to go for.
Say one quick thing about, you brought up class. I'm really glad you did, because it ties back to this issue of representation. One of the things that really worried me about Trump Care was how Medicaid was thrown in. And if you're looking at a group that does not have representation and they are not as active, you look at class as being they are not an active group with state representation. It's laughable when you think about the number of Congress members who have over $1 million. Excuse me, none of them have under $1 million in the Senate, if you go through and look. And if you look at the House of Representatives, very few, none of them are considered a lower class. So I think that considering all aspects of identity is really critical. And then if you look at that chart that I gave you, you end up with what I've seen as the one way to describe intersectionality is an onion. So if you have that chart, you've got underrepresented people, you've got women, you've got white males, you've got Democrats, and then you start to divide that chart up, you end up with so many layers and levels that it looks like an onion. And that's how I've always had intersectionality described to me. But then if a group doesn't have representation, like those who were going to be affected by Medicaid, what do you do? And that goes back to what your comments were, Jesse, that there's a group that they're not represented underneath the current system. And they just got lucky in this go-around. Anyway, those are my comments. Questions and comments? John.
Well, thank you very much for these presentations. I feel that I've learned a lot. So I thought that I understood practically what intersectionality might mean, even though I'm not in command of the disciplinary literature that we're talking about. During the Women's March in San Diego, where actually people of very diverse backgrounds were just participating. And that march actually gave rise to a number of lasting resistance movements, both of which we are somehow involved with right now. One is Indivisible, and the other one is Swing Left, basically organizations. They are, where we live in Encinitas, they are both well organized. And when I think about the meetings of both organizations, maybe nearly 95% of the participants and organizers are white women. So husbands come sometimes because they have to, right? And they are also coming from, because of the area, they are coming from quite privileged economic backgrounds. But I thought that actually intersectionality had a potential there when actually they rushed to the airport the first day of Muslim ban, and they were among actually those people who organized the resistance, women's resistance movements, protesting the Muslim ban in that first chaotic night. And I thought, wow, this is great, because it seems to me that it's really important to be able to stand for the rights of those you don't immediately associate with.
For sure.
And also because, identities are not really clear-cut, right? There is no such thing even as gender or even race. So these are fluids. So a couple of things I want to suggest. I wonder if you would like to, or anyone here would like to pick up on that. One is that compared to outside of the United States, American cities economically segregated. The level of economic segregation in the United States is extraordinary. That also is reflected in those resistance movements, because that's why the only non-Western person would be probably an Iranian immigrant who's also quite well off. So I mean, what is really the effect of spatial segregation in the United States? The fact that people of similar economic backgrounds live together, and no one of different backgrounds really is likely to live there. So that's one question. The second one is maybe more of a self-criticism toward USD, because when we discuss these issues or when we take action, and it's very commendable, the diversity actions we do, we didn't seem to really reach out to underprivileged people of the world. You see, I mean, there could be some scholarship program trying to bring actually people from the most poorest and underprivileged countries. And then their presence on campus in the classroom is extraordinarily important. I often hear actually colleagues, very thoughtful colleagues and others, thinking about international students through cliches. Because if the only international student that you face in your classroom is coming from a very privileged Gulf background or very privileged background in China, and you never in your life had a student from Yemen, never, right? Then I often hear basically people making these generalizations and immediately thinking that basically those international people must be coming from backgrounds. A personal note, I'm an immigrant myself, originally from Turkey, now an American citizen, but basically I studied in this country with full scholarship from MIT and then full scholarship from Princeton. So when I came in this country, I had $5 in my pocket. Do you see, I mean, so because those institutions made a commitment that their role as really leadership in making a difference in bringing people. And I feel that a Catholic institution also probably should be defining its goals in more global terms as well.
So you've got two questions. One is about, the second one is about the kind of student that we bring here to USD that would help us see the world differently. And then the first one had multiple dimensions. I don't know.
Well, I just want to say something quick on that. I think the framing of that issue, students to bring here, one has to be cautious in instrumentalizing people for our benefit. So yes, you want to provide opportunities for people, but then it has to be about them, not like, oh, and look, we could learn from you because now you're a tool of our education. I just think that is dangerous and worrisome.
I didn't mean to.
I know you didn't. I just wanted to, yeah. The other thing was so I would say that the issue of the women in the groups that you know rushing to address the potential legal issues at the airport, right, and protesting, that's a case of allyship, right, rather than intersectionality. So it's people who have a particular vision of social justice, see it being violated in a way that they themselves would not be subject to, so they want to function as allies and intermediaries. I think the concern that comes up, not in that particular context, but in the context of allyship, and sometimes this raises questions of intersectionality, is people in positions of privilege and power defining groups' interests or issues rather than listening to them do it themselves, right? And so if you have any group of all one people from one category, whatever it is, race, class, sexuality, aiming to speak for all other people in that category, that generally is not going to turn out well, right? So gay men cannot speak for all gay people, right? And when we think of gay issues, one of the main issues like gay marriage. Okay, I'm gay married, but Gay marriage was not a top priority for many gay people. It was not a top priority for many women. It was defined by a small class of gay men with a lot of money who wanted to pass that money on to their partners when they died. That's how it started. And so did it help the gay community? I don't know. It helped. It helped me. My wife's gonna get whatever I have when I die, which probably won't be that much, but so that's been a controversial issue. But we always have to. So if I stand up and say, well, as a lesbian, you should caution me about whatever sentence follows, because I don't represent all lesbians. I don't represent lesbians of color. I don't represent trans women. I don't represent trans men. I don't represent gay men. And I have something to say about the community, but if I stand up and say as an LGBTQAA, I can't even get it. I don't even know. There's so many acronyms I can't do it anymore. I don't speak for all those people. And that's the caution, or that's the concern about intersectionality.
That's why this legislative question is so hard as well. And the only time you can say it makes a difference is when you're dealing probably with rights issues. Then you can say that you stand up for it. Yeah, definitely.
Well, I wanted to address what I understood in your first question about the effects of spatial and economic segregation. Is that's a big one. That's the big question. I think what you pointed to, as solidarity, I think is really the upshot of these two books that I have here. It's the one that I had referred to earlier, as well as Angela Davis's new. There's intersectionality is not just about, again, it's not just about like for general edification, understanding people in a different way. It's to actually fashion the ability to, and I don't think empathy is the right word, but it's the ability to fashion meaningful solidarities with other oppressed people, right? Across the very lines that you're talking about. But if you can't get into how that oppression works, it's hard for you to find the points where you can actually show up for somebody else sometimes. So you were really referring to solidarity, where you show up for somebody else. And you keep showing up for somebody else, and everyone else keeps showing up for somebody else. And next thing you know, you have a movement that can address the multifaceted aspects in which people are oppressed. So you're right on top of that. And the purpose of economic segregation and spatial segregation is very much so that you can have these sort of zones, these privileged zones that are viewed as normal, right? So they're gated, they're well-resourced, they're opulent. And everywhere else, you can sort of just turn it into a containment zone as needed. So you can bring in the level of control, you can extract what you need from it. I work in City Heights, live and work in City Heights, and that's in certain ways kind of a bit of a warehouse of just all these people from the world show up, and there they go. It's in City Heights, but which I happen to love, like people from all over the world. But when you combine that, people that have a lot of need, like need for educational need, they have perhaps post-traumatic stress experience. They might be split throughout a transnational experience, so there might be like literal family obligations where they're required to or need to be resourcing other family, and on and on and on, right? If you put them all together in places where the education system is over impacted and struggling, where there aren't many jobs, where it's dense and it's lower quality housing stock than other neighborhoods, so you start to add in problem upon problem upon problem. Now you're getting into the logic of how intersectionality works and why it works through spatial segregation. So the point is to define these different kinds of zones and to keep them relatively contained and protected. So that building of solidarity, that sharing of oppressions along different axes allows people sometimes to literally for the first time connect to different neighborhoods. To literally different physical spaces that they're intended not to be a part of. It allows them to transcend language boundaries. It allows them to or at least begin to develop meaningful linkages across language, across religion, across race, gender, sexual orientation, things that in some cases may be very difficult for them personally or culturally to address. But at least it creates that ability for those to happen. So it's a very rich question. Thank you for that.
You probably know more than anybody else that the spatial segregation that we're living with now was created through legislative bodies, city councils who separated people. And it was in cities like New Haven, Connecticut, and in Atlanta, where you got groups that were working together, living together, and becoming allies of each other, that those broke down. In some cities, it still hasn't broken down.
But I was also going to say something, and then I'm going to call on you, Lori. You were talking about the women socialists. This goes back to the other part of your point. So the women were active in to get the right to vote. And then once they were done with that, they started a group of them allied themselves with the socialist cause and were quite active in that area for several years, which made a big difference in labor law. So, I don't know. Back in the back.
Hi, my name is Michael.
Michael, sorry. I know that.
Oh, no, no problem. I want to thank everybody for these questions. That we're looking at. I had a couple questions. I do think that sort of there is a usefulness in thinking about the importance of intersectionality, and I think the one thing you all are talking about is sort of like the sort of political economic ramifications of it. So I do think that sort of if we understand concerns about gender, sexuality, representation in response to really the long history of capitalism and colonialism, I do think that sort of it does suggest there still is an importance of a sort of identity politics attached to sort of our understanding of intersectionality, even though that those identity politics might be limited, right? But here's what I mean, because underneath Trump, but not just Trump, it does seem that maybe for the last almost 30 years with the rise of right-wing talk radio, identity politics has always been pushed back against. But it's only been sort of when identity politics is used through used to sort of gain more rights for oppressed people, right? So I think that's why I really like what Jesse is talking about, because it's like there's a way with sort of like a white male, sort of upper middle class identity politics being used to sort of make other people's identity politics invalid. But I guess I wrote here that if we understand the production of white heteropatriarchy as linked to a process of capitalism that removes oppressed people as a means to reproduce sort of white male power, then it does seem basically apparent that identity politics are a necessary arena of struggle. It surely isn't the end point of struggle, but it sort of is a place where, like, at least I think sort of I have to always think about starting. That's why I really like really like what you said about Angela Davis, because she seems to really sort of like take the onus for sort of change and even the limits of identity politics off of the people who are oppressed themselves and place it back on the system, right? Because I mean, because you know, when you talk about say the post civil rights, like Chocolate City, right? Detroit is always used as the example to why almost now that sort of black representation in politics doesn't work, right? So there's always, if you want to talk about sort of post-civil rights violence in the black city, you talk about Chicago. But if you want to talk about almost like an American sort of neo-colonial situation, like say you might talk about in Africa or something, it's always about sort of the problems of Detroit. You know, the problems of the school system, the problems of the police, political corruption over there, right? And no one ever talks about the way in which sort of the problems exist not because black political representation is wrong. We can actually say that black political representation is probably what's holding those places together from completely falling apart, right? What's making the place fall apart is the sort of way in which sort of capital has been removed from the place. So
Yeah, well, thank you, Michael. I love hearing your thoughts as you're stringing them together, and that's and just to maybe briefly address that, which is a very very big question. So what I really pulled out and lift up from what you're saying is identity politics is important implicitly when the cultural political landscape is about erasing you or totally misrepresenting you or burying you, right? So when the whole narrative becomes about these dangerous thug black men, and even though there's example after example, I mean, very few actual examples of that fit that particular thing. And it said, now the need to redefine yourself, the need to talk with people within the group about who are we, how are we going to identify ourselves, all those aspects of working through the process of examining and defining an identity politics is actually really crucial. Identity politics also comes into bear in the solidarity piece, because as you're working across lines, you're often having to rethink who you are. So, I mean, a huge one would be Black masculinity. Like the Black Lives Matter movement is a change as a challenge in many ways to very established ideas around Black masculinity, right? Because there's all of these versions that are brought in through the side door that people start to go, oh, I don't know if that represents, I don't know how far I'm willing to go with that. That's that community, that trans community. I don't know how far I'm willing to really go when it comes to lesbian politics. So it's basically constantly a challenge. Intersectionality constantly brings you to a point where your identity is in crisis, because you're having to recognize, you can't just sit with the limited number of ways you feel oppressed. You have to actually be able to engage the ways you are possibly an oppressor, or just straight out nothing to do with you, how other people experience their situatedness, and not always have to impose your wound or your one or two notes on every situation that you're dealing with, or only look for that. So absolutely very crucial. And then you actually tied it also into political mobilization and the more of the materiality of political economic, like how identity politics translate into actual political structures. That there's a whole other discussion there, but it's equally as important there, because it becomes, that's the very point of, we need our Black leaders. Boom, Black leaders come in, and all this, and it's not fixing anything. That calls into crisis the structures that will grow around the identity, just the straight identity politics piece.
Looking for a little more advice, being a student who engages with this kind of thought on campus or off campus, and when you interact with people who maybe deny intersectionality and want to focus on one specific group and never want to kind of, never want to, just observe intersectionality or acknowledge intersectionality rather. How do we as students kind of approach that? And especially with, I like what you said about recognizing the ways you're oppressed, but also recognizing the ways that you are an oppressor. Mm-hmm. How do we engage with that with each other when we come from, very different backgrounds of sorts, and we have our focus groups, or you want to be an ally, but check your privilege, or that kind of idea.
Yeah, you got it.
So I think that those are really difficult questions and things to grapple with. I'd sort of say 2 or 3 things. One is that just straight rational disputation aimed at the truth, although that is my discipline, is not often the best path to getting people to look at something in a new way. That is to say, providing very clear and cogent arguments doesn't often have an effect on people's beliefs about when emotions are involved, or political groups or identities are involved. I wish it did more, but so I think when engaging with other people, and if they're, say, denying that some group is subject to inequality or oppression, I would issue an invitation for them to read or hear from those people's perspectives. So, okay, let's just assume people aren't crazy. Let's start there. So they have some experience, they have some point of view, and this is how they see their life. Why? So I would ask people to engage their curiosity and learning about what other people's lives must be like before formulating the final position on how you should understand someone, right? And that's related to the second question about how to be an ally and check your privilege. Often it's helpful to listen, and groups affected with particular issues or policies need to be the agenda setters for that policy, right? It's to be really ineffective, but also potentially condescending and awful if you go into, if the dogs go into the cat whatever and tell the cats how they're gonna best accomplish their goals, right? So all of us, I think, myself included, need to engage our curiosity, our humility, a little bit more, and our listening.
I couldn't agree with Lori more. Engage your humility, engage your listening. But also, when you realize where you might be an oppressor, don't feel discouraged as well. I mean, just listen and learn from that experience. I've just talked to so many students who, when they start to see what was going on with the women and the abolitionists of the passage of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, they just want to throw out their feminism at that moment. Well, that's crazy. Just keep it open mind, just like Lori said. Jesse?
Yeah, it's a $10 million question, and it comes down to how to build solidarity. I definitely don't have a $10 million answer, but I can certainly say that at the risk of being cliche, I mean, if you do take that, be the change that you want to see, and you just try to internalize, because it has to be based on empathy. I mean, if you're really going to grasp, I mean, there might be some complete sociopaths out there that just don't give a shit, right? Like, that's possible, but I tend not to
It's
think.
not possible.
It's
It's
probable.
actual.
I was gonna say,
Okay, maybe I don't like to. That may be true. I don't listen to that. I consciously blind myself to that and believe the best in people, and I'm okay with that. But part of what I mean by saying that is that people will often frame their actions around their wound or their injury, right? And that's is sometimes is admitted and acknowledged. So I'm just thinking about like male gendering, like it's all wound, It's all like, I gotta be the biggest that, or the strongest that, or I've gotta outdistance my dad this or that. I mean, it's like, it's all of this like, I'm not enough, I gotta do all this stuff to go be more and more and more enough. So I'm just sorry, that's obviously a very broad generalization, but the point is, even the most highly accomplished go-getter is somebody that you could probably connect with at the level of, well, what really motivates you? And is it really just that you're the best, you're a superhero, and you're just gonna and you're just being a superhero? Or is there something when in your quiet time or your quiet space where you might be running away from something, or you might be trying to resolve something that's unresolvable from a previous point? So, I mean, I know this gets into it. When you focus on relationships, you focus on thinking about your own motivations, right? That it isn't just about looking a certain way or socializing with certain people, but that when you find the aspects of solidarity that really move you, it doesn't just become this blanket statement about like, oh, we in general, in theory, should connect with these other movements. It's more that you're motivated to connect with a certain other movement because of something that's meaningful to you. That makes it substantial as opposed to just formal, like just a sort of abstract formal argument. It's just kind of like, and then you understand what solidarity is about in your own terms, and that gives you a more of a basis to communicate with people in your group. And at the end of the day, I mean, you just may have different interests than some of the members, and then you might become one of these bridge type people that's in this group and trying to get that group to sort of grow in this other way. And all of those actions are actually very important. They're all worthwhile and they're all meaningful.
Can I just try to ask something that kind of speaks to what Mike was saying, something that sort of as scholars of intersectionality and these sorts of things, we've seen the rise of a very sort of cynical or sometimes ignorant appropriation of the language of identity and intersection by specifically white men, right? Is there a way that as scholars we can give sort of advice on how to retain the sort of depth of the concept as intersectionality becomes more and more a part of public discourse? How can we work to make sure that it's not one of these things that is just easily cynically misappropriated, but rather retains the depth? And I love the way that Jesse focused on saying, I think you're dealing with embodied experience of oppression. So
Yeah.
I might be wrong.
This is basic.
Do you have, from a scholarly perspective, sort of a way of engaging with this to sustain that depth?
I have a quick thought
Yeah.
that we have to stop talking about difference, ban that word from our vocabulary, talk about hierarchy. Difference can be turned into hierarchy, but I don't give a shit about difference, right? I care about hierarchy, and the only way you get the men's rights activists to get any purchase is by diluting your notion of oppression is purely difference-based, right? There isn't a hierarchy at which they're at the bottom. There isn't there. It isn't there. So we need to talk about hierarchy, not difference.
You know, if we're gonna get every single identity represented in our single member districts, we're gonna end up with a variety of different people. So that's just not gonna happen, and it's not gonna work. So what we're gonna have to do is exactly what Jesse and Lori are saying, is pay attention to hierarchy and pay attention to oppression. Everybody's responsible for that, because there's gonna be little change here. I can go give you a formula that shows you with the incumbency rate, it's gonna take 648 years to get rid of this particular chart, so, yeah.
Well, I just want to, can I just add a quick response? Because you basically said what I would say in theory, but I think practically speaking, it's about having materials that allow you to dive deeply into it. So it's like if you just stand there and lecture this stuff or repeat what you repeated from me and say these, you know how our students we like to think they listen, they hang on every word we say, but they're, but sometimes having the range of guest speakers, of having books, shorter articles, the social media level article type, so that gives you material to get into, to unpack at deeper levels what hierarchy actually might be. I think is a very important tool, and also you can do things like, not with guest speakers, it isn't always just a big thing like you have to go find somebody and hire them in. Sometimes you can have a student organization come. You can have, you can have a rainbow educator come, but you can engage them in a certain way, and you can actually get into the depths of some of these conversations in a really practical, tangible way here. And I think some of those can help pedagogy.
Kimberly Crenshaw has a TED Talk on intersectionality that's amazing.
Tim, you can have an active and vibrant humanities center that discusses these issues all the time. And thank you for coming. If you have any questions,